The story of China is one of the longest, most intricate, and most fascinating sagas in the history of human civilization, stretching back thousands upon thousands of years and weaving together legend, philosophy, power, war, invention, and culture. When we talk about the history of China, we are not simply talking about one dynasty or one period of time, but rather a vast unfolding of events, an immense river of stories that begins in the dim, almost mythical past and continues to flow right into the present day. To understand the overall complete history of China, we must first step back into the realm where legend and archaeology blend, into the age before written records, when ancient peoples settled along fertile river valleys, planting crops, building villages, and slowly laying the foundation for what would eventually become one of the world's greatest civilizations. Chinese tradition begins with mythic rulers whose lives and deeds may not be verifiable by modern evidence, but whose stories shaped the cultural imagination of China for centuries. The earliest figures spoken of are the legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, wise leaders who supposedly ruled with virtue and set humanity on the path toward organized society. Among them was Fuxi, who is said to have taught humanity how to fish, hunt, domesticate animals, and write down symbols, and Nuwa, the goddess who is said to have created mankind by molding clay. Then came Shennong, the divine farmer who taught people agriculture, medicine, and the art of herbal remedies. These rulers were not simply kings but almost divine beings, embodying wisdom and guidance. Later legends also include the Great Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, often regarded as the father of Chinese civilization. Huangdi is said to have introduced important inventions like the compass, the calendar, and even early forms of writing. His battles against mythical enemies, his creation of order out of chaos, and his unification of tribes into one confederation made him a cultural hero, and for centuries many Chinese people referred to themselves as the descendants of the Yellow Emperor. The mythical era flowed into the age of the earliest dynasties, where history and archaeology begin to meet. The first dynasty described in Chinese records is the Xia dynasty, said to have existed around 2100 BCE. The Xia is partly shrouded in mystery because, for many centuries, there was little archaeological evidence to confirm its existence. Yet stories of the Xia persisted in the ancient texts, speaking of its founding by Yu the Great, the legendary engineer who is said to have controlled the devastating floods of the Yellow River by dredging channels and building irrigation works. Yu became a symbol of perseverance and virtue, a leader who ruled not for personal gain, but to serve his people. While evidence of the Xia dynasty is still debated, archaeological sites from that period, such as the Erlita culture, suggest that there were organized states in the Yellow River Valley with palaces, bronze tools, and social hierarchies, perhaps giving us glimpses into what might have been a real Xia. Following the Xia came the Shang dynasty, which rose to power around 1600 BCE and stands as the first Chinese dynasty confirmed by both ancient records and archaeological evidence. The Shang kings ruled from fortified cities, and their society was structured around a powerful monarchy supported by aristocrats, warriors, artisans, and farmers. They were masters of bronze casting, producing weapons, ritual vessels, and art of astonishing quality. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Shang is their development of the earliest known form of Chinese writing, found inscribed on oracle bones, tortoise shells, and animal bones used for divination. Priests and kings would carve questions into the bones, heat them until they cracked, and then interpret the cracks as messages from the ancestors or the gods. These inscriptions are the earliest evidence of Chinese characters, and they reveal not only the concerns of the Shang rulers, such as war, harvests, and weather, but also the beginnings of a written tradition that has endured for over 3,000 years. The Shang dynasty was also deeply religious, with a strong belief in ancestor worship. They believed that the spirits of deceased kings could influence the fate of the living, so rituals and sacrifices were performed to honor them. The Shang rulers claimed a divine right to rule, establishing a tradition that would be reinterpreted and reshaped throughout Chinese history. But the Shang were not invincible, and by around 1046 BCE, they were overthrown by the Zhou, a people from the West who established one of the longest-lasting dynasties in Chinese history. The Zhou dynasty introduced a revolutionary idea that would profoundly shape China's political philosophy: the mandate of heaven. According to this belief, heaven granted rulers the right to govern, but only so long as they ruled justly and wisely. If a dynasty became corrupt or tyrannical, it would lose the mandate, and a new dynasty would rise in its place. This concept justified the Zhou conquest of the Shang and set a recurring pattern throughout Chinese history. Dynasties would rise, flourish, decline, and fall, only to be replaced by new rulers claiming that heaven had transferred its favor. The Zhou initially ruled as powerful kings, but as centuries passed, their central authority weakened and local lords gained more independence. This decline of central control gave birth to the feudal system of the Zhou era, where regional states held power under a nominal king. Despite political fragmentation, the Zhou dynasty was a golden age of intellectual and cultural development. It was during this time that the great philosophies of China emerged, philosophies that continue to shape Chinese society to this day. Confucius, living in the later Zhou period, taught the importance of morality, respect for hierarchy, filial piety, and the cultivation of virtue. His ideas, recorded by his disciples, became the foundation of Confucianism, which would guide China's social and political order for centuries. Alongside Confucianism arose Taoism, attributed to Laozi, which emphasized harmony with nature, simplicity, and the pursuit of balance through the Tao, or the Way. Legalism also appeared, stressing the necessity of strict laws and harsh punishments to maintain order in society. These competing schools of thought, known as the 100 Schools of Thought, reflected the intense social and political struggles of the time. As the Zhou weakened, China entered the period known as the Spring and Autumn Era, followed by the Warring States Era, times of constant conflict among rival states vying for power. This was a brutal yet transformative age, when warfare advanced through the use of iron weapons, cavalry, and new military strategies. It was also an age of heroes and intrigue, immortalized in stories of cunning diplomats, brilliant generals, and ambitious kings. Despite the violence, this period set the stage for the unification of China, as one state gradually rose above the others, the Qing. By the 3rd century BCE, the Qing, under the leadership of King Zheng, had conquered the other rival states through relentless military campaigns and ruthless efficiency. In 221 BCE, Zheng declared himself the first emperor of a unified China, taking the title Qin Shi Huang. This was the birth of the Qin dynasty, short-lived but enormously influential. Qin Shi Huang's centralized power, abolished the feudal system, standardized laws, currency, weights, and measures, and imposed a uniform writing system across his empire. His vision was to create a strong, unified state, and he enforced this with strict legalist policies, punishing dissent harshly and controlling information by burning books that contradicted his rule. The Qing dynasty is also remembered for its monumental construction projects. To defend against northern nomadic tribes, Qin Shi Huang connected and expanded earlier regional walls, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the Great Wall of China. He also built an extensive network of roads and canals to facilitate communication and troop movement across the vast empire. Perhaps his most astonishing legacy lies beneath the earth. The terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers buried near his tomb, each uniquely crafted to guard him in the afterlife. Yet the Qin dynasty was as harsh as it was ambitious. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and oppressive laws bred resentment among the people. After Qin Shi Huang's death in 210 BC, the dynasty quickly collapsed, lasting only 15 years. But the idea of a unified empire outliving dynasties had been set. The Qin had shown that China could be ruled as one centralized state, and this model would endure. Out of the collapse of the Qin rose the Han Dynasty, founded by Liu Bang, a peasant rebel leader who became Emperor Gaozu of Han in 206 BC. The Han Dynasty lasted for over 4 centuries, becoming one of the greatest eras in Chinese history. The Han rulers adopted many of the Qin's centralizing policies, but softened them with Confucian principles, creating a more balanced government. Confucian scholars were employed as officials, and the civil service system began to take shape, eventually evolving into the famous imperial examination system. The Han Dynasty expanded China's territory to an unprecedented scale, reaching into Central Asia, Korea, and Vietnam. Through conquest and diplomacy, they secured the Silk Road, the great trade route that connected China with the West, bringing silk, spices, and inventions out of China while introducing new goods, ideas, and even religions into the empire. The Han period saw incredible technological advancements. Paper was invented, astronomy and mathematics flourished, and agricultural innovations supported a growing population. Culturally, the Han established Confucianism as the state philosophy, embedding its values into the very fabric of Chinese life. But like all dynasties, the Han too faced decline. Court intrigues, corruption, peasant uprisings, and external pressures eventually weakened the dynasty. In 220 CE, the Han Empire fractured, ushering in centuries of division, civil war, and shifting kingdoms. The unity of China was broken, but the memory of the Han endured, so deeply that even today, the majority ethnic group in China calls itself the Han people, a testament to the enduring influence of that golden age. The collapse of the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century CE plunged China into one of its most dramatic and romanticized eras, the time of the Three Kingdoms. After the empire fractured, powerful warlords carved out territories, each claiming the right to restore order and rule all of China. The 3 rival states were Wei in the north, Shu in the west, and Wu in the south. Their constant struggles for supremacy gave rise to legendary battles, heroic generals, and tales of loyalty and betrayal that have been immortalized in Chinese literature, most famously in the epic historical novel romance of the Three Kingdoms. Figures such as Cao Cao, A brilliant yet ruthless strategist, Liu Bei, a leader admired for his loyalty and benevolence, and Zhuge Liang, a master tactician often portrayed as almost superhuman in intelligence, became cultural icons whose reputations have echoed through the centuries. While the Three Kingdoms period was marked by relentless warfare and suffering for the population, it also fostered innovation in military strategy and administration, and its stories continue to shape Chinese cultural memory to this day. Eventually, the northern state of Wei gained the upper hand, but its victory was short-lived, as it was soon usurped by the Qing dynasty. The Qing briefly reunified China, but internal conflicts and invasions from nomadic peoples beyond the Great Wall soon shattered their hold. The 4th and 5th centuries saw China splinter once again into smaller kingdoms, many ruled by non-Han peoples who had migrated into Chinese territory. This time of disunity, often referred to as the Age of Division, might appear to be an era of decline, but it was also a period of profound cultural transformation. One of the most significant developments during this time was the spread of Buddhism. Originally arriving from India along the Silk Road, Buddhism took root in China during the centuries of division, offering solace and meaning in an age of turmoil. Monasteries were established, scriptures were translated into Chinese, and Buddhist art and architecture flourished. Cave temples at places like Dunhuang and Longmen, filled with intricate carvings and murals, stand as enduring reminders of how deeply Buddhism shaped Chinese spirituality and aesthetics. While Confucianism remained influential, it was Buddhism, with its promises of enlightenment and salvation, that captured the imagination of millions during this era. By the late 6th century, after centuries of division, China was once again brought under a single rule by the Sui dynasty. The Sui emperors, though their reign was relatively short, played a crucial role in restoring unity and laying the foundation for future greatness. Emperor Yuan of Sui reunified the country through military might and political reforms, re-establishing centralized control. His son, Emperor Yang, embarked on ambitious projects, the most famous being the construction of the Grand Canal, a massive waterway linking the fertile south with the political centers of the north. This canal, stretching for thousands of kilometers, became a lifeline for the empire, facilitating trade, communication, and the transport of grain. Even though the Sui dynasty collapsed after only a few decades, largely due to the strain of constant warfare and massive labor demands, it had set the stage for one of the most glorious dynasties in Chinese history, the Tang. The Tang dynasty, founded in 618 CE, ushered in a golden age of Chinese civilization. Under Tang rule, China became one of the most powerful and cosmopolitan empires in the world. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest city on Earth at the time, a bustling metropolis filled with merchants, scholars, diplomats, and travelers from across Asia and beyond. The Tang dynasty's influence radiated outward, as Korea, Japan, and other neighboring regions adopted aspects of Chinese culture, writing, and political systems. Tang poetry flourished, with poets like Li Bai and Du Fu creating verses that are still admired today for their lyrical beauty and profound reflections on life. The Tang also advanced in the sciences, medicine, and technology, while Buddhism reached its peak influence, with monasteries wielding immense wealth and power. Militarily, the Tang expanded China's borders deep into Central Asia, establishing control over trade routes and strengthening the Silk Road. This allowed goods, ideas, and religions to flow freely across Eurasia, making the Tang dynasty a central hub of global exchange. Yet the Tang were not invulnerable. The dynasty faced internal rebellions, such as the devastating Lushan Rebellion in the mid-8th century, which weakened the state and led to widespread suffering. Though the Tang dynasty recovered somewhat afterward, its power gradually declined, and by the early 10th century, it collapsed, plunging China once more into division during the period known as the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. Despite the chaos, out of this fragmentation arose the Song dynasty in 960 CE, a dynasty that would mark another golden era in Chinese history, not through conquest and military might, but through culture, technology, and economic innovation. The Song dynasty faced constant military threats from nomadic peoples in the north, such as the Khitan Liao and later the Jurchen Jin. Yet despite these challenges, the Song presided over one of the most prosperous and sophisticated societies of the medieval world. The Song dynasty is particularly famous for its remarkable technological achievements. It was during the Song period that movable type printing was invented, making the reproduction of texts faster and cheaper, and leading to a dramatic expansion of literacy and knowledge. Gunpowder, first used in primitive bombs and fire arrows, began to change the nature of warfare. The magnetic compass, perfected by Chinese inventors, revolutionized navigation and opened the seas to long-distance travel. Advances in agriculture, such as the widespread use of fast-ripening rice from Southeast Asia, allowed the population to grow to unprecedented numbers. Culturally, the Song dynasty produced breathtaking art and intellectual achievements. Landscape painting reached new heights, with artists capturing the grandeur of mountains and rivers in delicate brushstrokes that reflected both nature's beauty and humanity's place within it. Neo-Confucianism emerged as a new philosophical synthesis, blending Confucian ethics with Buddhist and Taoist metaphysics, offering a vision of morality and cosmic order that would dominate Chinese thought for centuries. The Song economy was one of the most advanced in the world. The use of paper money, the expansion of trade networks, and the growth of bustling cities created a vibrant urban culture. Merchants thrived, and markets offered goods from across Asia, making Song China a hub of global commerce long before Europe entered its own age of exploration. Society became more complex, with a rising middle class and new opportunities for education and social mobility, thanks to the increasingly important civil service examinations. Yet for all their brilliance, the Song struggled militarily. Despite innovations like gunpowder weapons and advanced fortifications, they could not fully resist the pressure of northern nomadic powers. The dynasty eventually split into the Northern Song and Southern Song after the Jurchen Jin conquered the north. The Southern Song, though smaller in territory, remained a center of wealth, culture, and resilience for another century and a half, until they too faced the unstoppable rise of a new power from the steppes, the Mongols. The Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, created the largest contiguous land empire in world history. In the 13th century, they turned their attention to China, launching campaigns of devastating conquest. The Song dynasty, despite its resources and ingenuity, was gradually worn down. By 1279, the Mongols had conquered all of China, establishing a new dynasty, the Yuan, under the rule of Kublai Khan. For the first time in history, all of China was ruled by a foreign dynasty, marking the beginning of another dramatic chapter in the story of China. When the Mongols completed their conquest of China in the late 13th century, the course of Chinese history entered an unprecedented chapter. For the first time, the entirety of China was ruled by foreigners, and the dynasty they established, the Yuan, would leave a complicated legacy. The Yuan dynasty was founded by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a man of enormous ambition who sought not only to maintain the Mongol Empire, but also to adapt to the traditions of Chinese governance. Declaring himself Emperor of China in 1271, Kublai Khan moved his capital to the city we now call Beijing, then known as Khanbaliq, or Dadu, and set about building a regime that blended Mongol military power with Chinese administrative systems. The Yuan dynasty was distinctive because it combined the Mongols' nomadic steppe culture with the bureaucratic sophistication of Chinese traditions. Yet Kublai and his successors did not fully assimilate. The Mongols maintained privileges for themselves, dividing society into classes with Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. This social hierarchy bred resentment and tension, especially as many Chinese felt excluded from the highest positions of power. Nevertheless, the Yuan dynasty opened China to the wider world on a scale never before seen. Foreign merchants, travelers, and missionaries arrived at the Mongol court, the most famous being Marco Polo from Venice, who wrote vivid accounts of the grandeur and wealth he witnessed in Yuan China, tales that would fire the imagination of Europe for generations. Economically, the Yuan dynasty encouraged trade and maintained the Silk Road, which reached its height under Mongol protection. Caravans moved freely across Asia, carrying silk, porcelain, spices, and precious metals, while also transmitting ideas, technologies, and even diseases, such as the Black Death, which spread westward during the 14th century. The Yuan also expanded maritime trade, with Chinese ships reaching Southeast Asia, India, and beyond. But despite these achievements, the Yuan dynasty faced deep challenges. Floods, famines, and plagues struck the land, while heavy taxation and forced labor fueled popular discontent. The Mongols' inability to fully integrate into Chinese society, combined with corruption and mismanagement, eroded their legitimacy. By the mid-14th century, widespread rebellions erupted across China. Among them was the Red Turban Rebellion, which drew together peasants, former soldiers, and religious sects disillusioned with Mongol rule. Out of this movement emerged Zhou Yuanzhang, a former Buddhist monk and peasant who rose through the ranks of the rebel forces. In 1368, Zhou declared the founding of the Ming dynasty and drove the Mongols back to the northern steppes, restoring Han Chinese rule after nearly a century of foreign domination. The Ming dynasty marked a dramatic resurgence of Chinese culture, identity, and power. Zhou Yuanzhang, who became Emperor Hanwu, sought to rebuild a devastated country by strengthening agriculture, restoring land to peasants, and re-establishing the Confucian bureaucratic order. He was deeply distrustful of the elite and imposed strict controls on the court, while also reviving the civil service examinations to ensure that government officials were selected based on merit and Confucian learning. Under the Ming, the memory of Mongol rule fueled a determination to reinforce Chinese traditions and guard against foreign influence, though ironically, it was also under the Ming that China launched some of its most spectacular ventures abroad. During the reign of the Yongle Emperor in the early 15th century, China embarked on a series of grand maritime expeditions led by Admiral Zheng, a Muslim eunuch who commanded massive fleets of treasure ships. These voyages, which reached Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and even the coast of Africa, demonstrated the wealth, power, and technological sophistication of Ming China. Zheng He's expeditions carried Chinese goods and culture abroad while bringing back exotic items and tribute from foreign lands. For a brief moment, it seemed that China might dominate the seas and engage with the world on an unprecedented scale. Yet after Zheng He's voyages, the Ming court turned inward. The enormous cost of the expeditions, combined with threats on China's northern frontier, convinced later emperors to abandon maritime exploration and focus on domestic security. This retreat from the seas would have long-term consequences, as it left the oceans open for European powers who would soon arrive with their own ambitions. Still, the Ming dynasty presided over centuries of relative stability, economic growth, and cultural flourishing. Ming porcelain became world-renowned, Chinese literature and drama thrived, and architecture reached new heights, with the construction of the Forbidden City in Beijing, a grand imperial palace complex that symbolized the power of the emperor at the heart of the Middle Kingdom. But no dynasty is eternal, and by the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ming began to weaken. Corruption at court, factional struggles among eunuchs and scholar officials, and increasing pressure from nomadic groups in the north undermined the state. At the same time, the arrival of European traders and missionaries marked the beginning of a new era of foreign contact. The Portuguese established footholds along the coast. Spanish silver from the Americas flowed into China through trade, and Jesuit missionaries like Matteo Ricci introduced Western science, astronomy, and religion to the Chinese elite. While this exchange enriched Chinese knowledge, it also revealed vulnerabilities as European powers grew more assertive in Asia. The final decades of the Ming dynasty were marked by crisis. Natural disasters, epidemics, and widespread famine fueled uprisings, while the Manchu people, a semi-nomadic group from the northeast, grew in power. In 1644, rebel forces captured Beijing, and the last Ming emperor took his own life. The Manchus, seizing the opportunity, swept into China, defeated the rebels, and established the Qing dynasty. Once again, China fell under foreign rule, but this time it was not the Mongols, but the Manchus who would govern the Middle Kingdom, and they would preside over both one of its greatest expansions and one of its deepest humiliations. The Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus in 1644, would be the last imperial dynasty of China, ruling for nearly 3 centuries. The early Qing emperors, such as Kangxi and Qianlong, proved to be capable leaders who consolidated power, expanded the empire's borders, and presided over a period of prosperity. The Manchus adopted many elements of Chinese governance, presenting themselves as legitimate heirs of the mandate of heaven, while also maintaining their own distinct identity and privileges. Under their rule, China grew to its largest territorial extent, incorporating Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan, and asserting dominance over surrounding regions through a complex system of tribute and diplomacy. The Qing dynasty fostered economic growth and cultural achievement. Agriculture expanded, population increased dramatically, and trade flourished both within China and with the outside world. Chinese art, literature, and scholarship thrived, and the empire was admired for its wealth and sophistication. Yet beneath this surface of strength, challenges were brewing. The rapid population growth put immense pressure on resources, leading to poverty and discontent among peasants. Corruption and inefficiency eroded the effectiveness of the government. And most significantly, the rise of European colonial powers in Asia introduced a new and dangerous threat that the Qing were ill-prepared to face. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European nations sought greater access to Chinese markets, particularly for tea, silk, and porcelain. When the Qing resisted, tensions escalated, culminating in the Opium Wars with Britain. These conflicts exposed China's military weakness and forced the Qing to sign humiliating treaties, ceding territory such as Hong Kong and opening treaty ports to foreign powers. The so-called Century of Humiliation had begun as foreign nations carved out spheres of influence within China, undermining its sovereignty and exploiting its resources. Internally, the Qing dynasty was shaken by massive uprisings, such as the Taiping Rebellion in the mid-19th century, a civil war that cost tens of millions of lives and nearly toppled the dynasty. The Qing attempted reforms, but their efforts were too little, too late. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, nationalist movements, inspired by Western ideas and driven by resentment of foreign domination, gained momentum. Reformers and revolutionaries called for the end of imperial rule and the establishment of a new order. In 1911, after centuries of imperial history, the Qing dynasty fell, bringing to an end more than 2,000 years of dynastic rule in China. The abdication of the last emperor, the child ruler Pui, marked the close of the imperial era and the beginning of a turbulent modern age. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, the fall of the imperial order marked the end of an era that had endured for more than 2 millennia. For the first time in history, China was no longer ruled by an emperor claiming the mandate of heaven. Instead, it entered the uncertain experiment of republican government. The revolution was led by figures such as Sun Yat-sen, often remembered as the father of modern China, who dreamed of a nation guided by his 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. These ideals were meant to unite the fragmented land, strengthen it against foreign powers, and bring prosperity to its people. In 1912, the Republic of China was officially proclaimed, with Sun Yat-sen as its provisional president. Yet the reality of governing a vast, diverse country that had long been held together by imperial institutions proved far more difficult than revolutionary slogans could resolve. The early years of the Republic of China were marked by instability and fragmentation. After Sun Yat-sen stepped aside in favor of Yuan Shikai, a powerful general, the dream of a strong republic faltered. Yuan sought to crown himself emperor, a move that alienated much of the population and ultimately failed, plunging China into a period of warlordism. Regional military leaders carved out territories, each ruling with their own armies, while the central government in Beijing became weak and ineffective. Ordinary Chinese people endured hardship as constant battles, shifting alliances, and local corruption left them struggling for survival. Amid this chaos, new political movements began to emerge. Intellectuals, Frustrated by China's weakness and humiliated by the continued presence of foreign powers who held special privileges within Chinese cities, called for reform and modernization. The May 4th movement of 1919, sparked by outrage at the Treaty of Versailles, which handed former German concessions in China to Japan rather than returning them to Chinese control, galvanized a generation of students, thinkers, and activists. This movement called for science, democracy, and national rejuvenation. And from its energy emerged two rival forces that would shape the destiny of China for the next century: the Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The Kuomintang, revitalized under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek, sought to unify China under a nationalist banner. With military campaigns and political maneuvering, the KMT gradually consolidated power, establishing a government based in Nanjing by the late 1920s. For a time, it seemed that the dream of a modern, unified republic might be realized. Cities grew, industry expanded, and efforts at modernization began to take shape. Yet China remained divided socially and economically, with vast rural populations living in poverty while urban elites benefited most from modernization. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921 in Shanghai, initially cooperated with the nationalists in a united front against the warlords. But ideological differences and mutual suspicions soon tore the alliance apart. By the late 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek launched a violent purge of communists, forcing the CCP into rural strongholds. From the countryside, leaders such as Mao Zedong developed new strategies, focusing on mobilizing the peasantry as the backbone of revolution. Mao believed that China's rural majority, often overlooked by urban elites, held the key to transforming the nation. This idea would become central to the communist movement. The conflict between nationalists and communists soon escalated into a civil war, one that would rage intermittently for decades. The CCP, though weaker militarily, relied on guerrilla tactics and grassroots support, while the KMT controlled the cities and conventional armies. In the midst of this struggle, an even greater threat emerged: Japanese expansionism. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo under the figurehead rule of the last Qing emperor, Puyi. This marked the beginning of a long and brutal Japanese encroachment into Chinese territory. By 1937, full-scale war broke out between China and Japan, beginning with the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. The Second Sino-Japanese War would become one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. Chinese cities such as Nanjing suffered horrific atrocities, with the infamous Nanjing Massacre claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Chinese people endured unimaginable suffering as Japanese forces advanced deep into the country, and millions were displaced or killed. Despite their enmity, the nationalists and communists formed a fragile second united front to resist the invaders, though mutual distrust persisted beneath the surface. The war against Japan lasted until 1945, when Japan's defeat in World War II finally ended its occupation of China. For China, however, victory brought little peace. With the departure of the Japanese, the rivalry between the nationalists and communists reignited into a full-scale civil war. The United States backed Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government, while the Soviet Union provided limited support to Mao and the communists. The conflict was brutal, but by 1949, the momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the communists. The CCP's promise of land reform, peasant empowerment, and liberation from corruption resonated with millions of rural Chinese, while the nationalist government, weakened by years of war and plagued by corruption, lost popular support. In October 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop Tiananmen Gate in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The communists had triumphed, and the nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan, where they continued to claim to be the legitimate government of all China. This division between the mainland People's Republic of China and the Republic of China on Taiwan remains one of the most complex and sensitive issues in international politics to this day. Under Mao's leadership, the new communist state embarked on a radical transformation. Land reforms redistributed property from landlords to peasants, industries were nationalized, and efforts were made to eliminate old social hierarchies. Mao envisioned a new China, free of exploitation and inequality, built on socialist ideals. But his vision was also deeply shaped by ideology and political struggle, and the policies he pursued would have profound and often devastating consequences. In the 1950s, the government launched the first five-year plan, focusing on industrialization with Soviet assistance. Early results showed some progress, but Mao soon grew impatient with the pace of development. In 1958, he initiated the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious campaign to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. Peasants were organized into communes, backyard furnaces were set up to produce steel, and agricultural practices were dramatically altered. But the campaign proved disastrous. Unrealistic production targets, poor planning, and the disruption of traditional farming methods led to catastrophic famine. Tens of millions of people died, making it one of the deadliest man-made disasters in human history. The failure of the Great Leap Forward weakened Mao's position, but he regained influence in the mid-1960s with the launch of the Cultural Revolution. Declaring that bourgeois and capitalist elements threatened the revolution, Mao called on young people, the Red Guards, to rise up and purge society of old traditions, intellectuals, and perceived enemies of the revolution. Schools and universities were shut down, cultural relics were destroyed, and millions of people were persecuted, humiliated, or sent to the countryside for re-education. The Cultural Revolution threw China into chaos for a decade, leaving deep scars on society that would endure long after Mao's death in 1976. After Mao's passing, China faced a critical crossroads. The chaos of the Cultural Revolution had left the country exhausted, and many within the Communist Party recognized the need for change. Deng Xiaoping, emerging as China's paramount leader by the late 1970s, embarked on a program of reform and opening up. Unlike Mao, Deng was pragmatic, declaring that it did not matter whether a cat was black or white, as long as it caught mice. Under his leadership, China moved away from strict central planning and introduced market-oriented reforms. Agriculture was decollectivized, private enterprise was allowed to grow, and foreign investment was welcomed. Special economic zones were established in coastal cities, attracting capital and technology from abroad. The results were transformative. Over the following decades, China experienced one of the fastest periods of economic growth in history, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and reshaping the global economy. Cities expanded at a breathtaking pace. Infrastructure projects connected the vast country, and China emerged as a manufacturing powerhouse. Yet this rapid modernization also brought challenges. Inequality widened, environmental degradation accelerated, and tensions between economic liberalization and political control became increasingly apparent. The late 20th century was not without turmoil. In 1989, pro-democracy demonstrations centered on Tiananmen Square in Beijing drew global attention. Students and citizens called for political reform, freedom of speech, and an end to corruption. The movement was met with a violent military crackdown, leaving an unknown number of people dead and shaping the Chinese government's approach to dissent for decades to come. The events of 1989 revealed the limits of political openness, even as economic reforms continued. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, China continued to rise on the global stage. Joining the World Trade Organization in 2001 accelerated its integration into the world economy, and Chinese products became ubiquitous across the globe. The country invested heavily in science, technology, and education, aiming not only to catch up with the developed world, but to lead in key sectors of innovation. Its military modernized, its diplomatic influence expanded, and its role in international institutions grew steadily stronger. At the same time, the Chinese Communist Party maintained tight control over political life, ensuring that challenges to its authority were swiftly contained. Nationalism became an important tool for legitimizing the regime, as the government emphasized China's resurgence after the century of humiliation and its determination to achieve national rejuvenation. This narrative reinforced the idea that only under the party's leadership could China continue its ascent and avoid the chaos of the past. Today, China stands as the world's most populous nation and the second-largest economy, with aspirations of global leadership in technology, space exploration, and infrastructure development. Its Belt and Road Initiative seeks to build connections across Asia, Africa, and Europe, expanding its influence through trade and investment. Domestically, the government faces the challenge of balancing growth with social stability, addressing environmental concerns, and navigating the expectations of a new generation of citizens who are more connected to the world than ever before. The story of China, from its mythic origins to its modern power, is a story of resilience, transformation, and complexity. For thousands of years, dynasties rose and fell, philosophies flourished, invasions tested its strength, and revolutions reshaped its foundations. Through it all, China endured, adapting to changing times while preserving a sense of cultural continuity. To understand the overall complete history of China is to see not just a sequence of rulers and events, but a living civilization that has continually reinvented itself while carrying forward the weight of its ancient past.